We're diving into a murder mystery from the 1880s that'll make you question everything you think you know about justice. Picture this: a man swinging from the gallows, condemned for a killing that nobody actually witnessed. Was he guilty? Let's head back to post-Civil War Richmond and find out. Spring of 1885 brought a horrifying discovery that would shake the entire city. An investigation was about to unfold based purely on assumptions and fragments of evidence. There was nobody who saw what happened, no admission of guilt, just pieces of a puzzle that prosecutors claimed pointed to one conclusion. And that conclusion would cost a man his life. March 14th, 1885 started like any other morning for Lysander Rose. He managed the old city reservoir, walking the same route he'd walked 1,000 times before. But something was different that day. The pathway looked disturbed. The dirt had been scraped and moved, like heavy objects had been dragged across it, or maybe people had been fighting. That's when he spotted something in the water. A body, floating motionless near the edge. Authorities retrieved what turned out to be a young woman. The scene was brutal. Her clothing had been ripped apart. Dark marks covered her face. She stood barely 5 feet tall and was clearly expecting a child. Close to where she'd been found, investigators discovered a torn shoe and a single red glove. 2 distinct sets of prints were pressed into the muddy ground nearby. The first conclusion from the medical examiner seemed straightforward enough: suicide. Think about what it meant to be an unmarried pregnant woman in 1885 Virginia. Society would destroy you. Maybe she'd chosen drowning over the alternative. But when you looked closer at what the evidence was actually saying, that theory started falling apart. The ripped clothes, the injuries, the obvious signs of a fight. Nothing about this suggested someone calmly ending their own suffering. For days, nobody knew who she was. Back then, if you weren't carrying identification and your family wasn't actively searching, you could remain anonymous indefinitely. Authorities circulated what details they had. 2 separate people came forward claiming to recognize her. Both were wrong. Finally, 3 days after the discovery, someone made a positive match. Her name was Fanny Lillian Madison. Born in Virginia in 1863, Lillian came from a complicated family situation involving her parents, Charles and Lucy Madison. Things had deteriorated to the point where she couldn't live under their roof anymore. She'd been supporting herself through teaching and serving as a governess, moving wherever work took her. Right before she died, she'd been employed far from Richmond in Bath County. Once investigators knew her identity, everything shifted. This wasn't some random tragedy anymore. Lillian Madison had a past, relationships, people who knew her secrets. And here's what really mattered. She was 8 months pregnant when she drowned, so now the questions became sharper. If this was suicide, whose baby was she carrying? If this was murder, who needed her silenced? The medical examiner reconsidered the physical evidence and reversed the original determination. This was homicide. Lillian's life before that night had been defined by independence and struggle in equal measure. Women didn't typically live alone during that period, and those who did faced constant scrutiny. Cut off from family support, she moved from one teaching job to the next, maintaining a freedom that came with serious social consequences. People who'd known her remembered a competent, dedicated worker. She was physically small and naturally reserved. Her work as a governess meant living in other people's homes, serving families who needed her labor but didn't necessarily view her as their equal. She existed in this uncomfortable space between working-class poverty and the upper-class families she served, never fully belonging to either world. By summer 1884, she'd formed some connections that would prove critical to understanding what happened. She spent time staying with a family called the Walkers, between jobs. During July and August of that year, she was regularly around a young attorney named Thomas Judson Cluverius. Come October 1884, Madison had accepted that position in Bath County and left town. She was already pregnant by then. though she kept it hidden as long as possible. She kept teaching, kept working, kept going until her body wouldn't let her anymore. But as the pregnancy became obvious, her situation grew desperate. An unwed mother in 1880s Virginia faced absolute social annihilation. She'd lose every job prospect. Her reputation would be obliterated. The question of her intentions and who'd take responsibility became more urgent every single day. Thomas Judson Cluverius grew up in King and Queen County, Virginia. He'd earned his law degree from Richmond College back in 1882. A relative named Jane Tunstall had helped pay for his education and gave him a place to stay while he studied. Cluverius was trying to establish himself in the legal profession, which demanded respectability above all else. He was 26 that spring of 1885. Here's the detail that changes everything. He was Lillian Madison's first cousin. The relationship between Madison and Cluverius had developed gradually and quietly. Being relatives meant nobody would question them spending time together. But during that summer of 1884, when both were staying at the Walker residence, something had shifted from familial to romantic. People who saw them together later recalled behavior that suggested more than cousins catching up. Their interactions had an intimacy that family bonds alone couldn't account for. By the time Madison headed to Bath County that October, she was pregnant with what investigators would eventually conclude was Cluverius's child. This revelation completely transformed what the case was really about. This wasn't just about an unmarried woman and an unknown father anymore. This was first cousins in an illegal, taboo relationship that violated every social and legal boundary of that era. If Cluverius had indeed fathered Madison's baby, he faced total ruin. His legal career would evaporate instantly. His reputation would be permanently destroyed. The scandal would define the rest of his existence. These circumstances gave him, from the investigator's perspective, an overwhelming reason to make sure Lillian Madison never went public with their secret. Early January 1885 brought Lillian Madison back to Richmond. On January 5th, she and Cluverius checked into a local hotel together. She used a fake name on the register, Fanny Merton. A housekeeper who cleaned their rooms later swore under oath that Madison's bed hadn't been slept in that night. The meaning was obvious. They'd stayed together despite having no marriage. After this visit, Madison went back to Bath County. But the situation had reached a breaking point. Her pregnancy couldn't be hidden anymore. Any chance of resolving this quietly was rapidly disappearing. March 13th, 1885, saw Madison return to Richmond one final time. That evening, multiple witnesses spotted her with Cluverius. They were walking toward the old reservoir. It was late. The reservoir sat in a secluded, quiet area. Nobody reported seeing either of them come back. This was the last confirmed time anyone saw Lillian Madison breathing. What actually transpired during those missing hours remained open to interpretation and argument. Prosecutors would eventually claim that Cluverius deliberately brought Madison to that reservoir planning to kill her. Defense attorneys would suggest that Madison, overwhelmed by her circumstances, had taken her own life, while Cluverius was somewhere else entirely. Not a single direct witness ever emerged to describe what really happened that night. What they had instead were the clues left at the scene and the body found the next morning. When investigators went back to examine the reservoir after identifying the victim, they looked at everything more carefully. That broken shoestring near the water pointed to a violent struggle. The red glove seemed to have been lost or ripped away during some kind of physical altercation. The torn dress and facial injuries on Madison backed up the theory that she hadn't just walked peacefully into the water by choice. Those two sets of footprints near the scene proved she hadn't been alone. The location itself told part of the story. The reservoir wasn't some place you'd just stumble across. Someone unfamiliar with Richmond wouldn't naturally end up there after dark. Madison had either been taken there or had come with someone who knew the area well. The path down to the water was rough and barely lit. For a woman 8 months pregnant and barely 5 feet tall, Trying to navigate that terrain alone in complete darkness would have been extremely difficult and dangerous. That second set of footprints indicated she'd had company. The question was, whose company, and why had they gone there? Investigators also paid attention to what wasn't at the scene. There was no note explaining her intentions. There was nothing suggesting she'd weighted herself down or taken deliberate action to ensure she'd drown. The body's position and the evidence of a fight pointed toward violence rather than voluntary death. As the investigation continued, the murder theory gained traction while the suicide theory became harder and harder to defend. Among the items recovered near that reservoir was a small metal piece that investigators initially catalogued without much interest. It was a watch key, the type used for winding pocket watches that everyone carried back then. As the investigation zeroed in on Thomas Judson Cluverius, this seemingly insignificant item became critically important. Cluverius owned a pocket watch. Shortly before his arrest, people noticed his watch key had gone missing. When shown the key discovered near the reservoir, people familiar with his belongings identified it as matching what he would have carried. Cluverius couldn't provide a satisfactory explanation for how his watch key ended up at the scene where Lillian Madison died. He suggested maybe he'd lost it during some earlier, unrelated visit to the area. Investigators didn't buy it. The key had been found right near where Madison's body was pulled from the water and right near the evidence of a struggle. The timing of its disappearance, matching exactly with Madison's death, seemed way too convenient to be accidental. The watch key became a crucial component in the circumstantial case. It put Cluverius at the reservoir. Combined with testimony that witnesses had seen him and Madison heading that direction on the night of March 13th, it suggested he'd been there when she died. For prosecutors, the watch key was tangible proof connecting the accused to where the crime occurred. A tiny object carrying massive weight when no eyewitness existed. When confronted with everything building against him, Thomas Cluverius presented a defense that was simultaneously straightforward and frustratingly vague. He insisted that on the night Lillian Madison died, he wasn't anywhere near that reservoir. He claimed he'd been with another woman whose presence would account for where he was during those critical hours. This alibi, if confirmed, could have completely exonerated him. But Cluverius refused to say who this woman was. He wouldn't give her name. He wouldn't let investigators speak with her. He maintained that revealing her identity would damage her reputation and that he'd rather face conviction than subject her to scandal. This unexplained alibi became one of the strangest and most harmful elements of his defense. If this woman was real and if she could verify his story, why wouldn't Cluverius let her testimony save his life? Prosecutors argued the mystery woman was pure invention, a convenient fiction meant to create reasonable doubt without offering anything that could be verified or challenged. The defense maintained that Cluverius was being honorable, protecting a lady's good name even at tremendous personal risk. But to many observers, including jury members, the refusal to prove his alibi looked less like honor and more like an acknowledgement that no such alibi existed. Thomas Judson Cluverius went on trial May 5, 1885 in Richmond. The case immediately captured massive public interest. Newspapers nationwide covered the proceedings daily. The courtroom packed with spectators every single day. Prosecutors faced a substantial obstacle. They had no eyewitness to the actual murder. They had no confession. What they possessed were circumstantial details that, when assembled together, pointed toward guilt. The defense needed to convince jurors that these details, however suggestive, didn't satisfy the beyond reasonable doubt standard required for conviction. Prosecutors brought forward testimony establishing the relationship between Madison and Cluverius. They called witnesses who'd seen them together in the months leading to her death and on the night she vanished. They introduced evidence of Madison's pregnancy and the belief that Cluverius had fathered the child. They emphasized his motive, arguing that exposure of their illegal relationship and illegitimate baby would have obliterated his career and standing. They presented the physical evidence from the reservoir, including that watch key, the struggle indicators, and Madison's body condition. The jury weighed everything they'd heard. They considered the watch key, the testimonies, the motive, and the lack of any other reasonable explanation for how Madison died. June 1885 brought their verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. Cluverius received a death sentence by hanging. His lawyers filed appeals, but the conviction held up through every level of review. His execution was scheduled for January 1887. This case demonstrates the boundaries of certainty in our criminal justice system. Circumstantial evidence can be compelling, especially when multiple elements align into a coherent story. But it remains indirect. It demands interpretation. It requires juries to deduce what occurred rather than observe it firsthand. In the Cluverius case, 12 citizens examined the available information and determined that guilt had been proven. The courts concurred. The execution was carried out, yet doubt lingered in the minds of many who'd followed the case, and that doubt has never been fully put to rest.